There is a kind of silence you can only find in a workshop built by a man born in the middle of the 20th century. It is not an empty silence. It is a working silence. It carries the smell of sawdust that has settled into the grain of the walls. It carries the faint bite of old motor oil and cold iron. It carries the sound of a person who does not feel the need to narrate his own existence. In that room, nothing is performed, nothing is posted, nothing is optimized. The work is done because the thing is broken, and a broken thing has to be made right. When you grow up around that kind of quiet, you learn a strange lesson. You learn that meaning does not always arrive with a speech. Sometimes meaning arrives as a tightened bolt, a straightened nail, a door that closes properly, a lawn that gets cut before the heat rises. In the modern world, we are surrounded by a different kind of sound. We live inside the noise of the self. We broadcast our moods, we document our struggles, we track our inner weather like it is a national emergency. And to be clear, some of this is progress. We have learned language for pain that used to be swallowed whole. We have made room for people who were once told to disappear. We have become kinder in many ways. But in the middle of all this new language, a question hangs in the air. What if we gained words but lost weight? What if we gained expression but lost endurance? What if we learned how to name the storm but forgot how to walk through it? There is a generation among us that often seems made from a different material. We see them in grocery store aisles at 6 a.m. We see them moving slowly through parks with their hands behind their backs. We see them sitting on front porches as the sun goes down, watching the world like they have already seen it change 3 times. We call them baby boomers. Not all of them, not every home, not every story. This is not a census. It is a pattern, an archetype, a certain kind of American character that many people recognize the moment they hear it. They are the people who show love through competence. They do not always say the thing. They do the thing. A windshield is scraped before you wake up. A roof does not leak. The car starts in the winter. The bills are paid even when the month feels too long. The child is driven to practice again and again, even when nobody claps for the ride. From that ethic, a philosophy is formed, a hierarchy, action over feeling. In our current culture, we often wait until we feel inspired to work. We wait until we feel motivated to change. We treat feelings like the captain of the ship, but many in this older code were taught something else. The captain is the will. The feelings are the weather. The weather may be stormy. The weather may be unfair. The weather may be cold. But the ship still has a destination, and the weather is not a reason to stay in the harbour. If you grew up in a house where the grass had to be mowed, the dishes had to be washed, and the homework had to be finished regardless of your internal state, you were being handed a quiet superpower. You were being taught that agency can exist even when comfort does not. You were being taught that you can be tired and still be reliable. You can be anxious and still be steady. You can be hurt and still be a person of your word. This is why the Stoic boomer archetype often looks resilient. Not because they are made of stone. Because they practiced showing up until showing up became a reflex. To understand where that reflex came from, you have to look at the shadow they were born into. They were raised by people who stared into the abyss of the Great Depression. They were raised by people who endured the global slaughter of World War II. Their parents were not trained to discuss the inner landscape. They were trained to survive. When a soldier came home from the Pacific or from the frozen forests of Europe, he did not return to a world built around emotional debriefing. He returned to a world that expected a suit, a job, and a fortress for the family. For many of those parents, Stoicism was not a philosophy book on a nightstand. It was the only way to remain sane in a world that had tried to tear itself apart. So the child in that home absorbed a certain atmosphere. Love was not always something you said. Love was something you did. Love was a packed lunch. Love was a repaired fence. Love was a quiet hand on the back of a bicycle as it wobbled into balance. Love was the look that said, "I am here and I am not leaving, even if I do not have the words." And that is the first thing younger generations often miss when they judge the silence. Silence is not always emptiness. Sometimes silence is a container. Sometimes a person is silent because nobody ever taught them a safer language. Sometimes a person is silent because words were expensive in the house they came from. Sometimes a person is silent because they were taught that feelings are real, but duty is urgent. This is where the story becomes complicated, because every armor has a cost. The same silence that can make someone strong can also make them hard to reach. The The same discipline that keeps a family stable can also create emotional distance inside the home. The same commitment to endurance can turn into a habit of carrying pain alone, long after the pain should have been shared. This is why the boomer archetype can feel, to their children and grandchildren, like a locked door. The younger generation knocks, asking for conversation, asking for tenderness, asking for a map, and the older generation, often without intending harm, offers a different gift. They offer steadiness, they offer presence, they offer the quiet message that says the world is heavy, and you are still capable of lifting your part of it. Sometimes that gift lands as comfort, sometimes it lands as coldness. Both reactions can be true. Now place this generation inside the America that shaped them as young adults. The 1960s and 1970s were not a peaceful postcard. They were decades of disruption and disillusionment, assassinations on television, cities burning in riots, the promise of the space age colliding with the reality of war, gas lines, inflation, factories beginning to go quiet. Any one of those shocks could have made a generation retreat inward. But many did not have a cultural permission slip to collapse. They had a mortgage, they had a job that did not care about their inner weather, they had children who still needed breakfast in the morning, so they learned the art of control. They could not control the price of gas. They could not control the decisions of presidents. They could not control the speed of history, but they could control the quality of their work. They could control whether they showed up. They could control whether their home felt stable, even when the outside world looked like a storm. And over time, that practice creates a specific kind of confidence. Not the loud confidence of a performance. The quiet confidence of a person who has already survived a few collapses and learned that a human being can keep going. The modern world often misreads that quiet. We look at a generation that does not share its trauma publicly and assume it has no depth. But what if that silence is not a lack of feeling? What if it is a reservoir? What if the deeper question is not why they are so hard? What if the deeper question is what they had to become in order to stay standing? And if that is true, then the most important question for the rest of us becomes even sharper. What parts of their strength can be learned without inheriting the parts that made them lonely? The transition from a world of steel and smoke to a world of silicon and light was not gentle. For the boomer, the middle of life was not just a new decade, it was a new reality. They began in an America where value felt physical. You could touch the things you built. You could point to a bridge and say, that is ours. You could hold a paycheck and feel the weight of a week of effort in your hand. There was a straight line between sweat and shelter. And then, slowly at first, that line began to blur. Factories that once promised a lifetime began to go quiet. Main streets that once felt permanent began to thin out. Work that once required hands began to require screens. Neighborhoods stretched into global networks. The world became faster, more abstract, and more precarious. Now, not everyone adapted. Not everyone was treated fairly by history. Some people were pushed out, ignored, replaced, or simply exhausted. Some people carried bitterness. Some people carried grief. But the archetype we are talking about, the one you still recognize in the workshop silence, responded with a certain logic. The logic of duty. Duty is a word that has become unfashionable in modern vocabulary. We prefer words like passion, alignment, self-actualization. We are told that if we do not love our work, we are wasting our lives. We are encouraged to constantly audit our happiness, like it is a monthly subscription. But for many in that older code, duty was not a prison. It was an anchor. Duty meant you did not need to feel inspired to be reliable. Duty meant the importance of the task was not measured by how much joy it produced. The task was important because someone depended on you finishing it. The trash did not need to be loved to be taken out. The report did not need to be exciting to be accurate. The child did not need to be easy to be raised with care. This is not a romantic endorsement of burnout. This is not an argument against rest. It is an observation about a kind of psychological structure that helped people survive an unstable era. Because the instability was real. The late 70s and early 80s carried economic turbulence that felt like a storm that would not move on. Double-digit inflation in some years, gas lines that turned ordinary errands into planning sessions, interest rates that could climb to levels that sound almost fictional today, industries that had fed families for decades relocating across oceans. For a modern mind trained to treat discomfort as a crisis, that would feel like a reason for a collective breakdown. But many of these families did not have the option. So they did what their parents had done. They got practical. They doubled down on competence. They did not always call it resilience. They called it being responsible. They called it doing what you had to do. They called it, we will figure it out. Here is what that looks like in real life. It looks like a man in his 30s, exhausted, sitting at a kitchen table at night teaching himself a new skill from a manual because the old job is disappearing. It looks like a woman driving across town to a community college after work because the future is arriving whether she's ready or not. It looks like moving your family across the country for a job you do not love because the bills are not impressed by your personality. It looks like a first home computer on a desk that feels too small for the life you're carrying. A clunky machine, a blinking cursor, a feeling that the world is changing and you are late. And then, slowly, the cursor moves. The person learns. The person adapts. Not because they are fearless, because they refuse to be useless. There is a sentence that lives under this whole way of being. The only true security in an unstable world is your ability to be useful. This is why the workshop matters. The workshop is not nostalgia. It is training. It is a place where a person proves again and again that broken things can be repaired. And if broken things can be repaired, then maybe a broken week can be repaired. Maybe a broken year can be repaired. Maybe even a broken economy can be endured long enough for a family to remain intact. This era also produced a quieter story that many younger people only understand later. The vice of responsibility. What we now call the sandwich generation. Boomers were among the first to find themselves pressed between two directions of need for years, sometimes decades. On one side, they were raising children in a country that was becoming more expensive and more competitive. On the other side, they were caring for parents who were living longer, but becoming more fragile. This is a kind of pressure that does not arrive with a single dramatic moment. It arrives as a slow accumulation of Tuesdays. A child needs a ride, a parent needs an appointment, the car needs repairs, the roof needs attention, the boss needs the report, the laundry needs to be done, the dinner needs to appear, the dog needs to be walked, the day needs to be repeated. And here is the quiet truth. Many of them did not call it burnout. They did not perform their exhaustion. They did not create a personal brand out of their struggle. Their release valve was simple. The sound of a lawnmower on a Saturday afternoon, the feeling of finishing the cycle, the peace of looking around the kitchen at night and knowing the house is safe, at least for now. This is why younger generations sometimes do not see their sacrifices, because so many sacrifices were made in ordinary silence. If you want to understand their psychology, you do not study their slogans, you study their rituals, the coffee made before dawn, the briefcase by the door, the habit of showing up early, the way they fix the broken thing without telling anyone they fixed it. And yet, again, the story has a shadow. Because a life built on duty can become so structured that it forgets how to speak. A person can become excellent at carrying weight and terrible at asking for help. A person can become so used to being the pillar that they do not know what to do when their own foundation cracks. This is where the younger generations often feel the ache. They want the older generation to tell the truth out loud. They want a conversation, not just a functioning household. They want to hear, I was scared too. I did not always know what I was doing. I was lonely sometimes. I needed you more than I admitted. And many boomers, even when they want to give that, do not know how. They were taught that the most loving thing you can do is keep the machine running. So when you ask them to talk, they fix something instead. They buy groceries, they mow the lawn, they change your tire, they drop off a check, they show up to help you move, they speak through action, because action is the only language that was rewarded in the house they came from. Then the 1990s arrive and the digital age accelerates, and now the challenge becomes something deeper than economics. The challenge of obsolescence. Skills that took 20 years to master are replaced by software. Hierarchies that once made sense are flattened by the internet. The world becomes a place where the young can know more than the old. For many people, this is where bitterness can take root, because it is a strange pain to feel the world step over you. But again, in the archetype of the workshop, there is another response, the art of the pivot. Some became managers, some became mentors, some became the steady hands in the room when everything else felt like motion. They provided an organizational gravity that kept younger idealism from floating away. They reminded everyone of something that technology can never replace. A company is not just code. A community is not just connection. A life is not just information. A life is promises kept, punctuality, reliability, integrity, the ability to finish what you start. These are not glamorous virtues. They do not trend. They do not go viral. But they are the invisible infrastructure of every functioning society. This is where the modern critique often becomes too simple. We look at boomer focus on stability and call it greed. We look at houses, retirement accounts, and material goals and assume shallow priorities, but remember the origin story. Many were children of scarcity. They were raised by people who knew what it felt like to have nothing. To them, a house was not only an asset, it was a sanctuary, a physical promise that their children would have a stable place to grow. A retirement account was not only a pile of money, it was a vow that they would not become a burden. Even their material goals often contained a moral logic. Build something solid so the next generation can stand on it. And here is the part that stings. Sometimes the next generation uses that foundation to look down on them. This is why the story cannot be one-sided. The boomer code contains strength that we need. It also contains silence that can wound. So the question becomes more precise. How do you inherit the endurance without inheriting the emotional distance? How do you inherit the discipline without inheriting the loneliness? How do you carry the flame without turning it into a wall? Because in the world we are living in now, a world that feels both connected and strangely fragile, we need something that cannot be downloaded. We need internal gravity. We have information. We have tools. We have endless opinions. But too often we lack the quiet power that says, I will take care of it, and then does. That power is not a personality trait. It is a practice. It is built in the long middle, the years of quiet effort that nobody applauds, the years where your character is formed without an audience. And the truth is, most of life is the long middle. You do not build a marriage in a weekend. You do not build a career in a year. You do not build a soul through a series of short thrills. You build those things through the slow, rhythmic application of duty over time, by showing up when you are tired, by staying when you want to leave, by doing the next right thing when nobody is watching. And if that sounds heavy, it is. But it is also where something beautiful happens. Because over time, the person who keeps showing up discovers a quiet freedom, a freedom that does not depend on the mood of the day, a freedom that does not depend on the approval of strangers, a freedom that comes from being solid, from being the kind of person other people can lean on. In a world of constant noise, that solidity is rare, and the rare thing becomes the valuable thing. We are now watching one of the quietest transitions in American life, not a revolution with banners, not a collapse with sirens, a passing of the torch. A generation shaped by steel is aging into the winter of its story, while a generation shaped by screens is stepping forward into the heat of history. And in that handoff, there is a strange mixture of reverence and resentment. We talk about what the baby boomers own. We talk about what they changed. We talk about what they broke, what they built, what they should have done differently. Some of those critiques are fair, some of them are necessary, some of them are also too simple for a story this human. Because beneath the politics and the economics is something quieter, a fire that was lit in the middle of the 20th century and carried through crisis after crisis. A fire made from discipline, duty, and the stubborn refusal to collapse. Call it Stoicism, call it grit, call it endurance. Whatever name you give it, it is real. And as this generation moves further into the final act, the most important question is not only what they are leaving behind, it is what they know, and whether we are brave enough to ask for it while we still can. To younger generations listening now, it is easy to look at boomer stoicism and see only the walls. You see the emotional distance. You see the silence where you want conversation. You see toughness where you want tenderness. And you are not wrong to want tenderness. You have been raised in a world that values the language of the heart. You have learned to name anxiety, trauma, burnout, depression, loneliness. You have built a vocabulary that is, in many ways, a moral achievement. Because what cannot be named often cannot be healed. But here is the painful truth that many people are discovering in the year we are living in now. Language is not the same thing as strength. Awareness is not the same thing as endurance. A map of the shadow is not the same thing as the courage to walk through it. And in a world like ours, where the noise never ends, that distinction matters. The modern environment is a relentless machine of comparison. You're exposed to more information in one afternoon than many of your grandparents encountered in a month. You're judged by strangers before you have your morning coffee. You're surrounded by highlight reels that make your ordinary Tuesday feel like a failure. And in that house of mirrors, sensitivity can become a wound if it is not protected by a spine. This is not a criticism of sensitivity. Sensitivity is part of what makes you human. Sensitivity is what makes you notice what others ignore. It is what makes you compassionate. It is what makes you capable of love that is conscious, not automatic. But sensitivity without structure turns into overwhelm. It turns into paralysis. It turns into a life where you keep waiting for perfect conditions that never arrive. This is why the wisdom of the last Stoics matters, not because they are emotionally superior, not because their silence is always healthy, not because we should copy their walls, but because they carry a lesson that modern life makes easy to forget. You can feel everything and still keep moving. You can be anxious and still be reliable. You can be heartbroken and still keep your word. You can be tired and still show up with dignity. That is not denial. That is mastery. When an older person tells you to get back in the game, sometimes it sounds harsh. Sometimes it lands like they are mocking your pain. But often, under that rough phrasing, there is a strange kind of respect. They are saying, I believe you're capable of more than this moment. They are saying, I have seen people survive worse than this, and I know you are made from the same human material. They are trying to hand you a gift, the gift of competence, because competence is a form of mental health. When you can do something, you feel less helpless. When you can fix something, the world feels less hostile. When you can endure a hard day, your mind stops treating every discomfort like a disaster. This is the part of Stoicism that can be transferred without inheriting the loneliness, not the silence, not the emotional distance, the skill of recovery. Recovery is one of the most underrated words in the modern era. We talk about success like it means never falling. We talk about confidence like it means never doubting. We talk about strength like it means never getting hurt. But life does not work that way. Life is impact. Life is friction. Life is loss. Life is change arriving without permission. So the real measurement is not whether you get hit. The real measurement is how quickly you recover. The last Stoics lived this, sometimes without ever naming it. They did not build stable homes because they felt stable. They built stable homes because stability has to be built. They did not wait for the world to become fair before they tried again. They did not wait for the economy to calm down before they learned a new skill. They did not wait for their mood to improve before they made breakfast and went to work. They simply kept moving. And that is where their philosophy becomes something larger than a personality trait. It becomes a ritual. Rub dirt on it is a phrase many people remember from childhood. In its crudest form, it was used to silence, but in its highest form, it was a ritual of recovery. It was a way of saying, you are hurt, and you are still here. It was a way of saying, the world is hard and you are still capable. It was a way of saying, the same earth that bruised you is also the earth that holds you. The ground beneath your feet is older than your fear. It has seen everything. It has seen every fall and every rise. It has absorbed every tear and every drop of sweat. And the truth is, most people do not need a perfect life to be okay. They need a sturdy rhythm. This is where we can build a new American synthesis. We can take the best of that older code, reliability, duty, the long view, the quiet pride of being someone who can be counted on, and we can combine it with the best of the modern era, emotional honesty, inclusion, the ability to speak about pain without shame, the courage to ask for help. This is the evolution we actually need, a grit that is not cold, a strength that does not require silence, a resilience that is informed by empathy but not paralyzed by it. Here is what that looks like in everyday life. It looks like saying, I am struggling and I am still going to do the next right thing. It looks like admitting you are tired and still keeping your promise. It looks like asking for help without turning your life into a collapse. It looks like resting on purpose, not escaping by accident. It looks like building skills that make you harder to break. A budget you understand, a routine you can keep, a body you treat with respect, a craft you practice, a relationship you show up for, a promise you keep even when nobody is applauding. And it looks like speaking to the elders in your life with a new question. Not, why are you so hard? But, How did you stay so steady? Ask them about a random Tuesday. Ask about the Tuesday in 1974 when they were terrified, but went to work anyway. Ask about the night in 1982 when the bills were higher than the bank account, but they still made the house feel safe. Ask about the long middle, the years of quiet duty that no one recorded. Because in those stories is the secret to your own survival. And if you are the older person listening now, there is a question for you too. Do not only hand down the spine, hand down the heart. Teach the younger people how you kept going, but also tell them what it cost. Tell them where you were lonely. Tell them what you wish you had said out loud sooner. Tell them that strength and tenderness do not have to be enemies. Because the truth is the next generation needs both. They need to be able to hold a hand and provide a spine. They need to be able to cry and keep walking. They need to be able to feel deeply without falling apart. This is the relay race of the American story. Pioneers looked at wilderness and saw a home. Workers looked at depression and saw a future. Soldiers looked at tyranny and saw a mission. Boomers looked at a changing world and saw a duty. Now it is our turn. The world we live in is not going to get quieter. The challenges are not going to get smaller. But we do not need the world to be easier. We need to be stronger, not louder, stronger in the quiet way, stronger in the way that shows up on ordinary days, stronger in the way that keeps promises, stronger in the way that recovers quickly after a hard hit. So take a moment and imagine that workshop again. The smell of sawdust, the cold iron, the tools hanging in their familiar places. Imagine the hands that built things you never noticed. The hands that fixed problems without praise. The hands that kept the machine running so someone else could grow up with a chance. That is not just nostalgia. That is a blueprint. And the blueprint is simple. Accept what you cannot control. Commit to what you can. Do the next right thing. Recover faster than life can break you. Stand tall. Walk far. And when the world tries to knock you down, remember that the ground beneath you is solid and old and honest. Acknowledge the pain. Reach for the grit. Stand up. Because the day has begun, the game is still on, and you are exactly the kind of person who can finish what you started.